Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the exhibition. As you can see, it's an exhibition called History of ICU Through Its Buildings, and it's held here in the Hachiro Yuasa Memorial Museum on the campus of International Christian University. I'm Bill Steele. I'm a teacher here at ICU. I teach Japanese history, and right now my title is 60th Anniversary Professor. This exhibition is part of a 60th anniversary project to record, as you can see here, the history of ICU through its buildings. And we start here actually in the archaeological section of the museum. The museum houses both the campus archaeology and also the personal collection of Yuasa Hachiro, his folkcraft collection. But we start here. Instead of the normal entrance, we start in the sense the back door to look at the archaeological first, because we want to situate the history of ICU, the space. Where is ICU? The land. In other words, we want to give you a sense of space and a sense of place. And we hope here also, it's saying here, by walking through the archaeological section, of this, we hope to provide a sense of place, a sense of land on which the university was built. Moreover, by digging, literally digging into the history's past, this is very important. It's an important starting point to imagine and envision the future of the university. So in a sense, this is an exhibition about the university's history. But it's also an opportunity to think about the history's future, where we're going from here. Now, please come in with me, and you'll see this is, in a sense, one of ICU's very first buildings, maybe about 3,000 years ago, during the late Jomon period. And you can imagine here again the site of ICU, this dwelling. In other words, ICU is, we have 60 years of ICU, but it's built on land where people have lived for maybe 10,000 years. So that's one thing to get a sense of the history of the place. This might have been a house, it might even have been a school. It might have been a place where people were learning how to hunt, learning how to gather, learning how to use various kitchen tools we have here, or perhaps learning how to do various recipes, make food. But this is, anyway, we have here our starting point. So let's go up. Here's a sense of the land strata, but we'll go up and through the archaeological section to the main part of the exhibition. Okay? All of these materials that you're going to see were actually excavated, dug up on the ICU campus. And I think you can see here various pit dwellings where people were living here on this site, as I say, over the last 10,000 years. It's all done by students under originally the direction of Professor Edward Kidder. And I hope you had a chance to look at these materials. Here's an idea of the scale of the campus when it was originally set up. 1953 is when the opening of ICU. And at that time, the university, it was much larger and included the area which we now know as Nogawa Nature Park. Even the American School was part of ICU land. And over here, the Lutheran College, the Middle Eastern Culture Center, that also was part of the whole very large ICU campus. We're going to the various buildings here. I'll show you another map. Just follow me through here. But I do want to just, as we come through here, I mentioned that it might have been people were learning how to cook. When I was a student here, I took the course on archaeology by Professor Kidder, and we all gathered, we dug and dug, and it came up, and we uncovered these pieces of pottery, Jomon pottery, put them together, and actually formed, it comes into being almost like, just like this, amazing. But after our digging, we went to Professor Kidder's house, And Mrs. Kidder always served cookies to us. And she prided herself on actually helping her husband do research by making jomon cookies, which she made herself out of acorns on the ICU campus. And it so happens that there is not one of Mrs. Kidder's cookies, but over here you can see basically a fragment of a cookie, a type of food here. But anyway, you don't have to include this in the but you might want to look at a real jomon cookie. Mrs. Kidder's probably tasted better. Okay, come on in. Okay, what we have here, this is the main entrance to the exhibition. And this is, with this, we want to really commemorate the 60 years of ICU through its buildings. And that ranges from some of those buildings that predate ICU, going back to the Jomon period, or going back into, like we'll see here, the Taizanso buildings, which were built by Nakajima Chikuhei, and before him, Yamada Keisuke, setting up a sort of a tea ceremony garden, Taizanso, on the university campus in the late 1930s. And we'll also see some buildings like the Honkan, which dates from 1941 as part of the Nakajima Aircraft Company and its research center here in Mitaka. But we'll look at some of those buildings that predate the establishment of ICU to the construction of new buildings, the church and so forth, the library and the dormitories and so forth. And we want to look at the evolving role. We'll look at kind of chronologically at the buildings and see the role that they play in the educational life of students and faculty and the staff. And using this, we can, this history, 60-year history of the buildings, we hope to provide the information and ideas on which we can, again, think about the university's future. So let's go look at it, and I say we'll look at them fairly chronologically. This section right over here is devoted to the Taizanso, and I hope you all have had a chance to visit the Taizanso buildings. They are not originally here at ICU, but actually were brought in the late 1930s to form a sort of tea garden. Yamada Keisuke was a member from the Nissan. These were, and then later Nakajima Chikuhei, part of, which is now Fujijuko, at that time Nakajima Aircraft. These were very rich men, and they were able to bring kind of old farmhouses and old tea houses and other really culturally important buildings, which continue to be at ICU. But as actually, when the ICU first opened in 1953, many of these buildings, people didn't really realize their importance, and they were often used for university residences, or like faculty residences, or even some type of offices. I think the most famous building, the one-mat room, was actually used as a sort of a copy machine room at one time for the university. So it's interesting to look at the history of these buildings and how they were used. They are now recognized as kind of cultural treasures, of course. So let's go on a little bit further. Here you'll see a map that gives us a sort of overview of the university as it is now and its various buildings. That's how it is now, but the first envisioned plan of the university was done in 1949 by the Boris architectural company. And the original vision of the university, which the founder of ICU, Yuasa Hachiro, called a university for tomorrow, was a much larger building, a very kind of grandiose scheme. Here's the original, this is the heart, the Honkan, the main building, but around it were many dormitories and libraries and churches and museums, and there was a college of medicine, a college of agriculture, tennis courts, pools, gymnasiums, swimming pools. It was rather, a very ambitious scheme. What happened? Of course, the fundraising activities, and we'll see some of the posters over there, were rather aggressive and really well done. but then there was the Korean War and various things that they really weren't able to get enough money to build this. What ended up was really the core here. It's called here the liberal arts and humanities. It became really not this rather large university, but a much smaller, perhaps a college of liberal arts on the American side of a liberal arts, small liberal arts college was what actually ICU became. You'll look here, later on you can take your time and look at the sort of chronology of the university. But let's just look at the buildings here. The first thing you see here is the fundraising activities. And there's some posters. The idea to basically, as soon as the war ended, 1945, a number of people realized that Japan needed a new education system. In other words, one of the reasons why Japan may have gone to war was perhaps that the pre-war education system didn't really train students to think or think independently. It was more to be really obedient subjects, to be kind of loyal and follow the will of the emperor, but not so much to think for themselves. And particularly the founder of ICU, Yuasa Hachiro, who was himself in the 1930s, the president of Doshisha University, but forced to quit for his own independent thinking, for his own kind of criticism of the military. He spent the war years actually in the United States. And he returned to Japan right after the war with the idea, the way to really make sure that Japan never goes to war again is to have an education system that will really encourage students to think and think critically. A fundraising campaign was begun by Christians in the United States and in Japan in the late 1940s to help build the new university. Here you can see here a campaign poster in Japanese. Downstairs in the library, in the museum, there actually are all the cards of money that were gathered from even from small, very small donations up to larger amounts to help found this new university for the new Japan. And various activities took place in the United States and church, United States church activities and so forth. Christian organizations in the United States helped to gather money for the new university. Part of that new university, there is a man named McLean who actually urged not only donation of money, but also came to ICU with the idea of planting cherry trees. The idea would be as a sign of American donation of cherry trees to make a sort of sign of reconciliation between Japan and the United States. So this university was originally very much liberal arts, critical thinking, but also a university that was aimed for a new peaceful Japan, new democratic Japan, a new international Japan, and a Japan that would seek reconciliation with its former enemies, the United States and also countries like China and Korea and countries in Asia as well. The founding conference for the university took place in June 1949 at Gotemba. And here are the various founders, including the founder of the university, Yuasa. So now let me go over here to the actual buildings themselves. And the first building that we really should look at with in some detail is this rather forlorn looking building here, which is now the University Honkan. Many of you probably know that the library, the university was originally the Honkan was originally the research center for Nakajima aircraft. And in this building, various planning and strategies and designs of warplanes, particularly a transcontinental bomber, the Fugaku, was designed here with the idea of somehow, this was actually a sort of think tank to help Japan win the war. And the building was very much associated with Japan's war aims in the 1940s, in the Second World War. But this property was obtained by the university in 1949. The old Honkan, which had basically been left abandoned for several years, then was reconstructed. Again, the Voorhees company was called in to kind of consider how to rebuild the building. And here's the new, you can see here there's no fourth floor. A new fourth floor. The fourth floor was actually the university shokudo at that time. And then the Honkan here became basically the university. It included not only the classrooms, but also the administrative offices. It included the library. It included the language laboratories and the natural science laboratories and the student, and not only that, the faculty offices. Everything was in Hong Kong, including the shokudo at the top. Well, as I said earlier, the initial vision for ICU was for a much larger university with a medical school and a school devoted to agriculture. But they scaled it down, and it becomes, and it opens basically just with the Honkan. Very shortly after, this is 1953 when it opens, then we have here the University Chapel as the second major building for the university, and then that was complemented later with the university library. But still, the Honkan was the academic heart of the university. And it's quite interesting that it was once an instrument of war, but became instead here transformed into a building with an educational mission aimed at peace and reconciliation. If you go to the Honkan, be sure to look at the entrance of the Honkan. You'll see a plaque there that gives you a short history, saying this building was once, actually, interestingly, the Honkan was built. The construction of the Honkan was started on December the 1st, 1941. Do you know what day that is? December the, God, did I say 1st? No, December the 8th. December the 8th, 1941. Do you know what date that is? Pearl Harbor. In other words, the Chakko, the construction of Honkan, or what we call Honkan, at that time was the Nakajima, Research Center for Aviation, that it was begun on the same day as the outbreak of the war against the United States. So it's very intimately tied with, as you see, with war. So and the plaque says here that that this building is now dedicated to education promoting peace, tolerance, understanding, and respect for human rights between all peoples, all nations, and all religions. It was remodeled, again by the Voorhees company, and then the university church is the other building here. This was remodeling completed just before the opening of the university in 1953. The church over there, on the other hand, was completed in 1954. And it is then the spiritual heart, the spiritual center of the university. And then we have the library, and then also the very early buildings were some of the university dormitories were built. The idea of a liberal arts college here was for students and faculty to live and study together. And so dormitories and then also faculty residences. These were the initial university to have the classroom building, the church, the library, dormitories, and faculty residence. So to create a sort of community of faculty and students living and working and studying together. Well, let's go look at some of these other buildings, okay? The church you can see here, probably you don't recognize this church now. The initial church was built by Voorhees, and it has a sort of Spanish, sort of old world look to it. But in fact, this building in 1954, and the church that you recognize today, which was built in 1950, am I right? 1959. It's actually the same building. There was problems with the original building that had to be redressed. And the architect was different, a man named Raymond, who had a much more kind of sense of a modern style of architecture, rather than kind of the old Spanish, Italian type of buildings, to much more highly kind of concrete, stark modernism type buildings. And so even though it's the same building, you can see what a difference in architecture an architect makes. This was built and completed in 1959. Around here now, you'll see the early dormitories. Many of them actually no longer exist. You probably know that some of the dormitories already, the university is starting a modernization program. Many of these buildings, which were built 70 or 60 years ago, have decayed, have gotten no longer can use them for their original purpose. They're not really, and so they become actually, with lots of earthquakes and so forth, they need to be reconstructed. And so the old, like the first men's dormitory, the first women's dormitory, and so forth, some of them are they're still here, but actually most of the university dormitories have been rebuilt. But you get a sense here, again, of perhaps, 60, 70 students living together. The original dormitories, actually this is quite innovation. Most Japanese universities didn't have dorms. Most Japanese universities were more like commuting colleges where you would come and go. But the idea to have a community was something rather unique to ICU. So the dormitories were quite an important feature of the early ICU. There's some of the pictures, the third women's dormitory here. And you can see here from this early picture here, here's the university. You can still see some of the remains of the aircraft hangars and so forth out of the machine that were left over from the Nakajima era. A student, there was a sort of academic center here. The library here is being built. And perhaps if you look somewhat closer here, you can see the library, which is completed in 1950. Is that also 59? Yeah. And if you look here very closely, you'll see here's the redone Honkan, the university building, the library, which is under construction, the church, which is also being under construction here. So this is about 1958 when this is taken, because these buildings were completed in 1959. But also, if you look very closely, you'll see these mounds of dirt here. That's Bakayama. The kind of beginning, it was actually in the construction progress of the library that the dirt was relocated here in front of the Honkan, and then later grass grew on top of it and becomes what we now know and love, Bakayama, these sort of green spaces in front of the Honkan. More scenes from the life in the dormitory, the ICU cafeteria, which is now also has been replaced. But also something quite unique also is a university, is the Diefendorfer Memorial Hall. Diefendorfer was one of the Christian leaders in the United States who was active in the fundraising. He was actually the first president of the Japan ICU Foundation in New York. And in the process of gathering funds, he worked so hard that actually he injured his health and he died in the process of working for ICU. And many people, in memory, built a student union building, a building that was dedicated to primarily for student activities, various clubs, activities, and also a student faculty association, a type of student government. It was all located in what ICU students now call as DECON, the Diefendorfer Hall. And this was also a unique feature, showing, in a sense, the sort of student-centered nature of the university. Not so much centered on the teachers teaching, but on the students learning. And ICU's education, you can see in these type of buildings, is very much gives a good idea of the character and nature of this sort of education that the students and faculty engaged in right from the very beginning. So the student center. I'd also like to point out here, of course, the library. The library is also something quite unique. You know, all universities have libraries, right? But not necessarily this ICU was a pioneer in having a library where students actually can go in and look at the books, touch the books, take books off the shelf, and then sit down at a carrel or a table to read them. Quite often, the books were sort of, you had to order them and wait for them, and you couldn't actually browse in the stacks. This idea of an open access library was pioneered at ICU. And it was, the building is designed by the same, you can see from the cement there, Raymond, kind of modern architectural style. And again, it was a pioneering style of university library that was, many other universities came to look and learn from ICU and its library thereafter. You can see here the library here is only 1/2 of the present old part of the university. Later on, the second half was built, and then later in 2001, the Osmer Library was built behind it. And so it's grown over the years. But the original part of the library is this small corner here. It's on the left-hand side of the present university library. Then this gives you here a number of the faculty residences. Again, the idea of living and studying together meant that there were some like 50 residences built. At the very center of the university was the Honkan, and then there are buildings like the library and the church and the cafeteria, and then further out were dormitories, and then further out in parts of the, basically almost in wooded areas of the campus, were about 50 residences. That made ICU much different, because instead of faculty also commuting, giving their lectures and going away, faculty are on campus 24 hours a day and in contact with students, not just in the classroom, but on Bakayama, in the library, in the cafeteria, and of course during their office hours. So it was very important to have faculty residences. And many of these residences had parts of them large living rooms and areas for students to come and be part of, in a sense, part of the family, part of the ICU family. Come in and have dinner with, come in conversation with members of the faculty in their homes. Okay, I wanted to show you the chicken house. You know, ICU in the 1950s, this was immediate after the war, and people were not, didn't always have access to food, lots of food, or people were poor. And ICU, the tuition was actually very inexpensive, but part of the jobs that you could do would be to work on the ICU farm. And ICU actually had cows. You can see behind you there, ICU milk. And all the way up into the 1960s, and I was a student here at ICU in 1967 and really enjoyed ICU milk, a nice full cream milk. And there you can see that milk bottle there. But also it had cows for the dairy, and goats, and chickens, and pigs. It was actually a kind of a working farm. People, and of course growing vegetables and other foodstuffs as well. That area that we see now know as Nogawa Koen was originally part of was really farmland. There was rice and other things growing down there. And then up on the top there were also area pasture lands up now where the ICU high school is. And this is quite an interesting document. Maybe you want to look at it later, because it's also a chicken house that's designed by that very famous architect Voorhees. I'm not sure how often he designed chicken houses, but ICU, there's a whole list of the plans of the early university, including the chicken house here. And it was a sort of pioneering style of chicken house too. Okay, so that gives us back in the 1950s. If we shift to the 1960s, we're going to see here economy improves. From the 1960s, the Prime Minister announces a sort of economic doubling plan. And so these become, actually the 1960s, Japan's economy begins to take off, sometimes growing at 14, 15, 16% GNP every year. So during this rapid economic growth period, we see actually ICU also starting to modernize its facilities, build new buildings, and sort of take some of the weight off the Honkan. There's a new buildings, it says here. First of all, some of the new dormitories. Canada House, for example, was built in 1962. The 4th Women's Dormitory in 1964. The student body was growing larger. Beyond its, a few hundred students, it now has 500 or 1,000 students. And there needs to be new dormitories. But also natural science. A natural science building called Enkan was built in 1966 because the facilities in the Honkan were just no longer adequate. They needed to have a proper science education, you need proper laboratories. 1966, and you can see later on pictures of the natural science building. And also needed to have better physical education facilities. A gymnasium, a swimming pool are finally done here. Well, let's just kind of look at that. Here's Canada House, 4th Women's Dormitory, and then and here's the picture of the natural science building. And it also, I think, was a prize-winning building and a new style of science education for Japan. Remember, Yuasa's idea was to build a university for tomorrow. And he kind of tried to always say, well, we're going to build a building, let's make it a pioneering building. Let's make it something new and different. And of course, thinking also as a building that will actually enhance the educational experience of the students. And such was the natural science building, and here is the physical education building here. One of the probably first buildings with sort of solar panels to heat the water for the swimming pool. Okay, so let's move on. I should also, there and here, you can see some of the chairs. Again, this goes back to the 1950s, but in an age when you didn't really have lots of money, and you can't just say, to give me a very good, solid wooden desk. ICU also had its own carpentry shop, making bookshelves, desks, and these sort of student tablets, student desks, which were all made here on ICU. It's a sort of as if it was almost like self-sufficiency back in the 1950s. I hope if you haven't had a chance to sit in one of the original chairs as part of the tour, I hope you have a chance to sit here and feel what it would be really like to be a student back in the 1950s. We have some photos being shown there as well. But let's go on from, this was the 1960s, and then the next section here is going to be about the 1970s, in which Japan becomes much more a global power. Its economy by the 1970s is the second largest industrial and economic power in the world, and becomes much more active internationally. And so its buildings also start to reflect that international importance of Japan and ICU's role in promoting internationalism in the 1970s. Kind of come around here, look please. The golf course was sold to the metropolitan government in 1975. And at that point it was turned into a nature park. With the proceeds for that sale, in other words, ICU received a great deal of money from the central government. And they were able to create an endowment, which was called the 25th Anniversary Fund. And this money that they used, and is actually still very much active in the ICU endowment, they used this money to strengthen ICU as a global university. By the late 1970s, Japan was the world's second largest economy. And even in those days, in the late 1970s, some people dreamed that maybe Japan might even be the world's #1 economy, maybe in the 21st century. So that meant a lot of people in Japan were being active overseas. And many companies expanded into Europe, the United States, had offices overseas, or in Germany, in France, and also in Korea and in China, in Taiwan. So actually what happens, and then if families are moving overseas, that means that many children are growing up in overseas. And sometimes parents were worried, well, maybe that my children, can they really go to a Japanese university? Maybe their Japanese skills need a little bit of help. And these are called kikokusei, kind of people who kind of come back. So actually one of the things that ICU did in 1978, the ICU High School was built with the expressed idea of as a sort of a high school that will actually accept students from overseas whose Japanese level may not be perfect, but who will improve their Japanese, but at the same time maintain their English or their other foreign language abilities. So the ICU High School was built to meet the needs of this growing number of returnee students. And also the size of the university started to grow. And the university became having a larger number of international faculty. Myself, I came to ICU in 1980. So new international faculty and also more international students, particularly so-called kugatsei, September students. The number starts to also increase in the 1970s. And this means, of course, that there's more demand for classroom space. The library gets crowded, the honkan gets crowded, the university faculty, the various offices are getting crowded. Everything is sort of needs to grow up a little bit. And so what happens is that, first of all, in 1977, the first of what comes to be later, 2 buildings which in ICU we call the ERB, the Education Research Building, ERC building number 1. It's this building right here. This is actually where I have my office, which I moved into as soon as I came to ICU. But the Education Research Building was for university offices and also for some of the research centers. And then they needed to have, so that meant that university offices left the honkan, set up in a separate building. And then the administration, the president's office, the education affairs office, the finance office, all of those, the buildings and grounds offices, which were in honkan, were put into a new administration building. And this is completed in 1978. I don't know if you've seen, if you look at it, but if you look at the building, maybe the next time you walk in front of it, you'll see there's actually a world map, kind of indicating the sort of global nature of the university here, impressed just very vaguely. You can see it there, I think. So a new honkan, a new administration building, and then also there needed to be a new sort of Education Research Building, the IRC, the Integrated ILC, the Integrated Learning Center, with, again, the teaching, the laboratory, the language laboratories in the honkan. We're using the old tape and reel-to-reel and so forth. So instead of using that sort of antiquated language laboratory, kind of the very first-rate, state-of-the-art language laboratories and language learning equipment were set up in the ILC, the Integrated Learning Center, and also the beginnings of what were going to be high-tech education using, well, not yet computers, but various sort of sophisticated technology to enhance learning was pioneered here in this ILC building. So as the new ILC building was built, and then actually here at the ICU Museum, the Yuasa Museum was built in 1978, and then and finally kind of capping off this whole during the old, like the 10 years of growth and becoming more and more international, is the Education Research Building, which housed the new International Division. The university originally had, now there's no divisions, but it had an education division, a humanities division, a social science division, a language division, and a division of social sciences. And then a sixth division was added in 1990, the international, the Kokusai Gakkei, because the importance of international studies was so obvious in the 1990s. And it had its own building here, Education Research Building, number 2. Okay, that takes us into the 1980s. And then we have another stage of building, which is connected. Perhaps some of you students were here at the time in 2008 when ICU undertook a major curricular reform or academic reform, which actually those sort of early divisions were raised to have just one gakubu, one school of liberal arts. Again, the idea is that instead of trying to isolate students into certain categories, or even to ask them, even before they came to the university, well, you are in humanities, you are in social science, as if you can somehow actually create a system where students come, work, take classes, talk with students, talk with faculty, talk with advisors, and then after maybe 2 years of kind of looking around generally, then they kind of settle on a major of something that interests them, or it could be a single major, it could be a double major, or a major and minor. And I think many of you students are now in that new system. Well, this is in the years after the year 2000, an era, an age of academic reform, but also not only was the curriculum reform, but actually a number of new buildings, really to bring ICU into the 21st century. So we have here one of the ICU library. We have all here, you can hear the construction of a dormitory called Global House, and a new style of dormitory, which actually had it was co-ed, women and men are in different floors, but it also had sort of rooms with, it had its own kitchen and its own sort of living space where kind of communal living. So it's a new style of dormitory. And again, the idea was here was actually, the Global House was originally idea that it would, most of the dormitories were filled first by the shigatse, the April students. This would be filled first by the September students, and then to create a space that would be more kind of a joint living experience between Japanese and non-Japanese students. Then also was built here a dialogue house, which is now, that meant the whole, the dining facilities, the shokudo had become really antiquated. So building a new dining hall and a new sort of residential facility for short-term stay, both for students who might want to come and study at ICU only for one term, but also for visiting faculty, visiting researchers, to and also a conference center, an international conference center. So the dialogue house here was constructed, and it was completed just a few years ago in 2010. And also, if we have a picture here, I think don't see a picture here, the library, the Osmer Library, was also completed in 2000. I think it's around 2003. I may be wrong. 2001. 2001, and the Osmer Library was also a new addition, again, to update, again, a 21st century, again, putting ICU's library on the pioneering stage, forefront of libraries in Japan. You might have using its automatic retrieval system, for example, which again has attracted a great deal of attention from universities throughout Japan. So here we have then going into really building a campus for the 21st century, and also for an educational experience that meets the needs of the 21st century, that's going to enhance its liberal arts, critical thinking, problem-solving skills, and international peace activities. So you might say here, just at the end, what we've seen here, we started off in 1953 with Yuasa's slogan, "A University for Tomorrow," but we also end up here at the epilogue here, "A Liberal Arts University for Tomorrow." It says here the diversity of ICU's buildings and its landscape reflect both the heritage and the future of the university. We're now at the 60th anniversary of the founding of the university, and as we consider where to go now, it's important to remember the past, and as a way in which we can be more responsible for the future. And a term, I'm, as you know, the 60th anniversary professor, and there are many 60th anniversary projects, including this exhibition, but all of these projects have a key word involved being dialogue. And so we hope that this exhibition of the buildings of ICU serves to initiate a dialogue between the past, the heritage of the university, and its future. And that we should be always kind of very careful to preserve the heritage, to preserve the, where we preserve, basically it's our identity, where we came from as we are building a future, and not just sort of, just kind of close and just tear down buildings and build anew, but keep a good record, a good idea of where we've come from, to preserve our heritage as an essential way in which we can fulfill the mission of the university in the future. And so its past, its present, and its future are very intimately linked, and we can see this through the history of the ICU buildings. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good time looking around the exhibition by yourself at somewhat more leisurely pace. Thank you.